I'm Brendan Vaughan, editor-in-chief of Fast Company, and this is the second episode of Office Hour, my show about what it takes to lead in a world that never stops changing. On today's episode, I'm talking to David Miliband. If you're familiar with British politics, and of course you are, you might remember David from his time as the UK's Foreign Secretary and as a member of Parliament for the Labour Party. But in 2013, he left politics to become the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, which is a global humanitarian aid organization. I wanted to talk to David because funding for humanitarian work has been upended this year. The Trump administration, spearheaded by Elon Musk and Doge, canceled 83% of USAID's foreign aid contracts. David described U.S. investment as the anchor of humanitarian aid around the world. So what happens now that that anchor has been pulled up? David and I talk about that as well as the ongoing work they are doing in Ukraine, Gaza, and Sudan. We also discuss how the IRC is using AI to better anticipate humanitarian crises. I'll be honest, this was a sobering conversation, but I think it's an important one for the Fast Company audience to hear right now. Here's my conversation with David Miliband. David, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
So let's start at the very beginning, if that's okay, just to set things up for our listeners. Tell us about the International Rescue Committee. What is the mission of the organization? And kind of give us a little bit of the present day orientation.
Well, the mission of the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, is to help people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, to recover, and to rebuild their lives. So it's a big but quite precise mission. I think it honors our founder, Albert Einstein. You can't do much better than that.
You cannot.
The IRC was created by Einstein and 50 of his fellow intellectuals in the 1930s. They were appalled, frustrated, fearful of what was happening in Germany. And they thought it was a disgrace that the US was not welcoming Jews, intellectuals, persecuted minorities into the country. And Einstein wrote letters to Eleanor Roosevelt to try and get her to persuade her husband to change policy. But out of frustration, really, he turned to action and he helped create what we now would call an NGO, a non-governmental organization. From a single employee in Marseille in 1940 who issued fake passports to people like Marc Chagall, we're now, I joined 11 years ago. We've grown from being $500 million then to $1.5 billion a year now. We have around we had until January the 20th, and we'll come back to that, around 20,000 employees in 330 field sites in countries that are either in conflict, so Ukraine, Syria until recently, Gaza, Sudan, the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, places where people have fled from conflict, perhaps within their own country or across a border. And we're unusual because we're both an international humanitarian aid agency, health, education, water and sanitation, protection for women and kids. We're an international humanitarian aid agency, but we're also a refugee resettlement and asylum support agency for people who arrive in the US or in Germany or in other richer countries. And we talk about working across the arc of crisis, but we're quite loyal to our mission in that we don't want to just become an NGO that chases every problem, chases every funding source. We're in 30 to 40 countries. We're focused on people whose lives are turned upside down, and we're about giving them a new start.
So conflict specifically. So, the most obvious example of that is war. I know you talk about the climate crisis as a source of this conflict. What about economic conflict, economic circumstances? Is that part of your mission or no?
Not so much, no. It's interesting that extreme poverty today is in the main in the majority of cases caused by conflict, fragile and conflict states. That's why Sudan is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. It's the greatest concentration of extreme poverty. Extreme poverty means that you're living on less than $2.15 a day. There are 300 million people in humanitarian need, which has obviously got a big conflict element to it. And that's a big change because 30 years ago, 80% of the extreme poor just lived in poor countries, notably China and India. What we've seen in the last 30 years is that countries that are stable, whether they're democratic or autocratic is another question, they're stable, they've got governance, they've got markets, they've got some property rights. they help people out of poverty. The places where conflict blows up the government, blows up markets, blows up property rights, it's very hard for people to get themselves out of the most extreme circumstances, and they depend on international aid organizations, amongst other things. Of course, people forget this. Remittances, so money that's sent from a migrant in a richer country to someone in a poorer country, those are about $700 billion a year compared to an aid budget of about $210 billion. So it's important to have this in perspective. But if you're in extreme poverty in a conflict state, the IRC is there to try and help you. And we helped about 38 million people last year.
So your parents were refugees, having fled Belgium and Poland, fled from the Nazis. How much did your personal and family history have to do with your desire to take this job 10 years ago?
A bit, I think. I said in my job interview that there were 3 reasons that I was interested in the IRC. One was that I like difficult problems and how you deliver medical aid in Syria, how you deliver education under the Taliban in Afghanistan. Those are big and difficult questions. Secondly, I thought that the IRC wasn't well known. It was a bit of a sleeping giant. I mean, you don't get much better than being founded by Einstein, so we should be making more of that. And then thirdly, I said that my parents were refugees, so in some way I was closing a circle. I wouldn't say it was the main driver, but I suppose as one gets older, you become more conscious of life's circle, really.
Let's get into the current moment, the Trump administration specifically. IRC is obviously a global organization. You are based here in New York City. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So how have the administration's funding cuts affected the IRC's operating budget and ability to affect change in the world?
Pretty severely. We are proud to have partnered with U.S. governments of all stripes. About 2 million of our clients have lost services in the last 4 months.
Okay.
So just in the first part of the administration, pretty soon within coming to office, 9 days after coming to office, they announced stop work orders for all international foreign aid contracts and grants. That was then amended to say, well, you can carry on with your life-saving services. But around 2 million of our clients, in the very large majority internationally, so kids getting education in Afghanistan, out. Families dependent on livelihood support in Niger, out. Sexual and reproductive health services, out. So there's been a big set of losses. About, of the 70 plus grants and contracts we had with different parts of USAID or the State Department, more than half of them have been annulled.
More than half?
Yeah. In total. In terms of the cash volume, about half of the work that we were doing with the US government has been stopped. Obviously, every government that comes in, it has an absolute right to review.
Sure.
What was different this time is that they went back to previous agreements and annulled them. There's also on the domestic front where refugee resettlement, that's the organized transfer of the most needy refugees for a new start. Here we were due to help 17,000 new refugees in America this year. That program's been stopped 4 months into the year, so that was stopped on January the 20th, so that's had a pretty severe impact too. Obviously, there's 2 sets of questions raised by that. One you raised, which is, well, how much impact does that have on your services for clients? Pretty severe. There's a second question, which must be in people's minds. Well, if you lose hundreds of millions of dollars, how's the financial situation? We're actually doing well. We're blessed with a very smart board as well as staff, and we all agreed that the absolute key was to make sure that we didn't run into a crunch on the cash or on the cash flow side. We're managing our finances well. We've had to lay off large numbers, thousands of staff members. Obviously, they were delivering the services to these 2 million people. So we're a bit smaller than we were 4 months ago.
Where were you before and where are you now?
We were about 1.5, just over 1.5 billion. We'll be a few hundred million short of that at the end of this fiscal year for 30th of September. Obviously, fiscal year 26 then has potential for further reduction, but we think that our strategy, which is all about impact, cost effectiveness, innovation, that's why we know each other and why Fast Company have featured us over the years, including this year. We think that stands us in good stead. We think we offer, when we say we can deliver a vaccine shot for $4 in East Africa to kids who have 0 doses, that's a moral question, but it's also a strategic question, frankly. We think we're offering something very important, and we want to carry on doing it.
1.5 billion before, a couple hundred million less than that is what it's looking like. What about numbers of people? Because you did mention layoffs.
In terms of our staff, we've had to lay off between 4,000 and 5,000 people.
Okay.
Out of around the world, out of about 20,000.
Wow. Okay. Significant. Two parts to this question. What are some specific things that you've had to, unfortunately, not be able to do anymore as a result of that? And how do you make those choices? Is that the administration saying we're isolating this specific thing and saying no more? Or are you choosing those things?
Two parts to the answer. First of all, the grants and contracts that are cancelled by the US government, that's their choice. So a very large education program for boys and girls in Afghanistan was stopped, annulled. Livelihood support in Niger. Sudan, I've mentioned the world's largest humanitarian crisis. We were supporting refugees in South Sudan, another very poor country. The program was stopped. So our job is to lay off the staff, stop the services. There's a second part of this, obviously, which is that we have to make sure that if our programs are being shrunk, our infrastructure doesn't end up too big. In fact, we want to be more productive, so we've actually cut our infrastructure more than we've cut our programs. And that's where there's more choice and you've got discretion, but obviously the headquarters staff is very small compared to the overall size of the organization. People in the field, the vast bulk of our staff, 96% of our staff, are from the countries where we're working. So if we're in Sudan, it's Sudanese. If you're in Syria, I've just been to Syria, it's Syrian staff who are there. But in the HQs, both the global HQ in New York, regional HQs in Amman, in Berlin, in Nairobi, we're having to lay off international staff as well.
Has anything like this ever happened before in this NGO sector? Anything quite like this?
No, this is unprecedented. The US is the anchor of the global aid system. It's not just a large donor alongside the European countries. It's more or less equivalent. It's a very large donor, but it's also investing upstream. It's investing in some of the things like the famine early warning system that was US funded. It's doing a lot of the basic research. So you've got end to end a very big shock to the system. I would say it's like this. I think the best metaphor is that the US has been the anchor of the global system. I'm not a seafaring person, but if you're on a boat and you pull up the anchor and the seas are choppy, you get a lot of seasick passengers. And that's, I think, what's happening at the moment.
What conflict zones are occupying the bulk of your time right now?
The good news is that I don't have to think of the answer off the top of my head. Every year we publish our emergency watch list in December. It's the top 20 humanitarian crises. Number one, Sudan. 16 million people in humanitarian need in the Horn of Africa, critical place, massive civil war. Gaza, very significant. Syria, until recently, a terrible war zone. Ukraine, very significant for us, very dangerous for us. And then places that don't get any attention at all. Myanmar, used to be called Burma. Very significant needs there. Was in the news because the Rohingya were driven out of there 7 years ago. So I think those are top of our time. I try to spend about 20% of my time on programs, 20% on strategy, 20% management, 20% finance, fundraising, 20% advocacy and communication. And so the program side, I think we're loyal to what the evidence shows is where we're needed most.
How is the dynamic, and this can be day to day, it can be the danger, it can be the fundraising piece of it in Ukraine? How has that changed?
It's moved from being a refugee crisis out of the country to being a crisis for those who are stuck in the east of the country. We have, if you think about the east of Ukraine bordering Russia, it's like a clock face going more or less from 1 or 2 o'clock through 3, 4 o'clock down to 5 o'clock. And around that curve, we have mobile health teams that are trying to help people who are elderly, disabled, can't move, won't move, but are close to the front line. As you head to the west of the country, there's a functioning society and a functioning economy, despite the fact that there are missile strikes that are happening. And then for those refugees who've gone, women and kids who've gone to Poland, Germany, UK to some extent, I don't want to say it's been normalized because they've got brothers, husbands, fathers in the fight, but state systems have moved in there. When the war started 3 years ago, you were at Berlin railway station. We're not there now. We're in the east of Ukraine, where it's a very bloody and in some ways old-fashioned fight.
What about Gaza?
We've got about 55 people working for us in Gaza. It's an incredibly high level of need, massive displacement, and real imminence of famine, effectively. That's what the UN, it's called it's a panel that's specially convened to assess hunger. It's called the International Phase Classification System, and they say a quarter of the population's on the brink of famine. That is in accord with what I spoke to our staff last week, they're not feeding themselves so they can feed their kids. And that's obviously speaks to the issue of the blockade on aid. We've got 27 pallets of medicine and nutritional supplements blocked. But it also speaks where the Israeli authorities have now let in between 50, 60, 70 trucks a day compared to about 500 before the war started. But there's also important not to lose sight of the ceasefire question, because even if you get the aid flowing, if the ceasefire doesn't come, it's very, very difficult. We've so far not lost any of our staff in Gaza, but this ceasefire question, which is obviously critical for the civilians but also critical for the hostages, is there. So these two questions of the aid flow and then the war fighting intermingle with each other, and neither is getting solved at the moment.
You just said about not having lost anybody holds. Another organization we've covered quite a bit is World Central Kitchen, Jose Andres, which of course that is not true of, sadly. What about the fraught politics of this particular crisis? How does that affect someone in your shoes?
I think it's really important that we are very, very focused on our humanitarian mission. And so from my previous life, I've got all sorts of things I've said about the politics of the Middle East, but I don't say them in this life. I don't unsay what I've said before, but I don't have to get into them. So questions of two-state solutions, should Jerusalem be the capital of a future state of Palestine, that's not our business. Our business is, what's the situation on the ground? What are we seeing? What can we do to help relieve humanitarian suffering? And that's been a very good guide. The humanitarian principles are challenging. Neutrality, impartiality, independence, and humanity. Those are the four humanitarian principles. And stick to them is the overriding issue in any of these incredibly toxic conflicts.
What is the role of business in the face of these cuts? I read an article in Semaphore where one quote in particular stuck out to me. The core of the argument is that if you want to enjoy the fruits of globalization, you need to bear the burdens. This was basically the context is you saying, we have lost funding. Business is inextricable from all of these global currents. These things are connected. So business has a role to play in replacing some of this funding, if I read that correctly.
Yeah,
is that correct?
That's right. The quote's from me, I think. I think that's important. Our argument is business support, private support is our patient capital. It's our innovative capital. It's our high-risk appetite capital. It's doing the things that government isn't well set up to do. It's much tougher to take risks if you're in government. But in this case, it's also got to be some replacement capital, because our argument is a very simple one, that if you don't go to where the problems are, the problems will come to you. And that destabilization is dangerous. Now, you can say, well, Sudan's a long way from the US. Syria is a long way from the US. That's obviously true. But we're speaking to global business. We're speaking to American companies with European, Middle Eastern, African partners. And it's not an easy argument to make, because we don't believe that there's a one-for-one replacement that businesses can do or is going to do for government funding. The USA, just to take that was part of the US government that's being cut, was $40 billion a year. You're not going to get a one-for-one replacement for that. But I think that there is an important point, both as an argument about what employees expect, but also an argument about what makes strategic sense, that these problems fester. And their consequences are not just political if they're not addressed. The unmet humanitarian need is a source of political instability. Political instability is a source of business risk. That's the argument we tried to make. And we've also made the argument that employees respond well when they see their companies, the companies they work for, doing the right thing. Now, as you know from the writing in the magazine, this is not an easy climate in which to make this argument. It's a contested argument.
Yes.
And that's why I think it's important we say there's a role for business. It's not a replacement for government, but it's nonetheless a strategic play, not just a nice to have.
Are there some businesses that come to mind that have really stepped up in the wake of this?
I think that stepping up hasn't been the order of the day in the last. I think there is a lot of business that's trying to figure out what's the new lie of the land. We've had donors who've stepped up, and some were giving $25,000 and now they're giving $75,000. Some were giving $250, now they're giving $1,000.
Individual donors? Or
yeah,
business?
individual.
Okay.
And then businesses have said, no, I want to be there with you. In the nicest possible way, I'd say they're not looking for a lot of publicity about it at the moment because they're trying to figure out what are their equities in this. We've had donors who've said, I want to make sure that you and your clients benefit from this period of upheaval rather than me benefit. So we've had people have gone from being $1 million donors to being 5 or even bigger donors. So there's been some pretty serious fundraising. Just to emphasize, though, it can't replace one for one. We've still got to we want to make the case to the administration that while reform is always on the agenda, we consider ourselves to be the reformers of the humanitarian sector. Retreat from these problems is not going to make them go away. And we think there's a vital American interest as well as a vital American role in playing this. Of course, other countries should do their bit. We're very much on the front foot about that. But we want the U.S. government to realize that this is a strategic investment. And unfortunately, the budget that's been proposed by the House of Representatives and by the administration looks about 85% cuts in international aid and diplomacy. We want to engage and at least give the ammunition to show $4 to immunize a kid in East Africa, $80 to keep a kid off the streets in northern Nigeria. These are worthwhile investments. And I use the word investment advisedly.
Going back a moment to what you said, so the donors that are, in some cases, increasing, some of those numbers you mentioned are significant increases, they're doing that, but they do not want publicity for it.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to this fact that the danger is everything gets politicized, everything gets weaponized. And it's a sad state of affairs when doing good can be weaponized against you, but not everyone has the same definition of doing good.
That is very true. Now more than ever, I would say.
Now more than ever. And so one has to respect that. You've got to respect that because people have got the whole point of having a range of interests is you've got to do justice to the range of interests that you've got, and you've got to hedge against uncertainty, of which there's a lot.
Let's talk about the southern border of the U.S. for a moment. What is the IRC doing that intersects with that issue?
We work on both sides of the border. On the southern side of the border, there's enormous humanitarian need in Mexico, but also further south in Colombia, where there's a lot of Venezuelan refugees. Extraordinary number of Venezuelans have left the country. And most refugees want to stay close to their homeland. We found that in respect of even the Syria crisis. But in respect of the south of the southern border, we're trying to provide the basics. A lot of abuse of kids, a lot of sex trafficking. We're trying to support kids and women who are at risk. On the northern side of the border, on the U.S. side of the border, our view has always been that an orderly approach is in the interests of the host country and those who are seeking asylum. That speedy decision-making is in the interest of the host country and in the interests of those seeking asylum. That those who qualify, for whom it's not safe to go home, they want to be effectively integrated into American life with a job, with an English language, with a path to citizenship. Those who are not admitted, who fail the asylum test, then it's the government's job to make sure that they are returned to where they came from. And so we try and play a role on both sides that I would say is a humanitarian role and is not a political role.
What would you say to critics who argue from an economic and a business perspective that incoming refugees are just bad for the job market and the economy in general?
Well, I'd ask them to look at the evidence. I mean, the U.S. government's done its own study, actually, of refugees in particular. These are people who have a reason to flee from their home country, not of economics, but of politics, if you like. They're net taxpayers. They end up contributing to the American economy rather than being a drain on the American economy. And there's probably a simple reason for that. If you know the price of oppression, you are ready to work your socks off when you've got the freedom to do so. And so we have pretty good evidence about what refugees are able to contribute. It's in no one's interest that there hasn't been an immigration act in the United States since 1986. And so the immigration system is broken, and that ends up overloading the asylum and refugee system, and that's not in anyone's interest.
So I was listening to you on Chris Hayes. This was a while back, but seems like it's still relevant, maybe more relevant than ever. And the point you were making was this, I believe the point you were making, and correct me if I misunderstood this, but it's a false choice between sort of being humane and being orderly when it comes to immigration. And this kind of stark dichotomy that is set up to, if you want to be humane about it, you're just a sort of a bleeding heart. If you want to be orderly, you're a cruel xenophobe who does not want to see anybody who might be some shade of brown coming into the country. How do you combat that idea that it's one or the other and make an argument that there is somewhere something in between?
I think evidence, facts, stories from the ground. I mean, the truth is that cruelty is not a very efficient policy. And if it's your only policy, you end up in a big mess because the people smuggling that is the response, and this is an issue in Europe as well as in America, you end up driving people into the hands of the people smugglers out of the legal system. And you actually want people in the legal system. That's the simplest way of putting it. The other thing is that you've got to think about how you sustain the countries that are hosting most refugees. And the better job you do at that, the easier it will be to manage those who are coming here. I mean, if you think about the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015-16, the civil war started in 2012-13. People were in Lebanon and Jordan. They ended up fleeing into Europe because they weren't getting support in Lebanon and Jordan. In the US case, the way in which Colombia is hosting 2, 3, 4 million refugees over the last period, the passage across the Darien Gap has been because there's been grave limits on the kind of support people were getting. And I've never understood that. You've got to be willing to go upstream if you're going to address problems.
Last question about the current moment. How does this compare to what you expected in 2025?
I think that on the domestic front, the Trump campaign was absolutely clear that it would stop refugees coming into the country. So I don't think that would be a surprise. I think that in our scenarios, we knew that there would be tough questions asked about foreign aid. We see ourselves as the reformers of the humanitarian sector. We're big on impact evaluation. We do about 30% of all the impact evaluation in the humanitarian sector.
And that's from a much smaller percentage of the total
We're
amount.
3% of the total sector and 30% of the impact evaluations. And we thought that we would be able to engage with the administration and show them what works and what doesn't. We didn't have it in anything like our central case, that there would be a hand coming in to previously awarded grants by previously elected administrations. And that's really caused the kind of convulsions that you've seen across the sector.
So let's shift gears a little bit into technology. We cover a lot of technology here at Fast Company. You published a piece in Wired not long ago about how humanitarian organizations will harness AI's potential. Where do you see solutions emerging on that front? The answer can be AI, can be other technologies as well.
Starting with the AI, we run Signpost, which is our global architecture for localized refugee information. Now, you can't do it all in English. The AI is going to help a lot. You can't do it all with people. Translation. For the routine questions, you want to have quick answers. We can increase the speed dramatically. There's been a lot of false starts, secondly, on computer-aided learning. But actually, we've got some very exciting developments on that front, using AI to help kids displaced, traumatized, education interrupted. We think we've got some work going on with an Indian software company, Upended it's called. We're excited about that. We're trialing at the moment the use of AI to diagnose mpox, to photograph lesions.
Oh, interesting.
And to try to use. So, look, I don't need to tell you there's a revolution going on, and if you don't understand it, you get swallowed up by it. So we're trying to use the benefits. There's obviously also big internal questions about how we can be, grant applications, all sorts of things you want to improve at. Now, you're right. It's not just AI. The thing that you featured, by the way, I should mention this, a lot of humanitarian work is reactive, but actually we want to be proactive. And you featured this anticipatory action. You can tell 7 to 10 days in advance when's the flood coming, when's the drought coming. Let's use the predictive analytics to help arm people on the wrong end of this, farmers notably, to protect their livelihoods. We're excited about the potential there. But it's not just AI. We've got to be careful not to think everything has a technological answer, because it doesn't. Sometimes low-tech solutions in our context work better. Measuring the upper arm circumference of a malnourished kid is the fastest way to get a pretty accurate diagnosis. You don't need a flip phone. You don't need an iPhone. You don't need a smartphone. You just want to work pretty effectively. Now, we nonetheless think that there's, even if you think back 3 years ago, before the latest phases of what AI has demonstrated, there was a lot of catch up for us to do. And we're keen to do that. In the health area, there's a whole thing to do with understanding our health records. We think we can mine our health records for information much better. So data management is a big thing for us going forward.
What about Airbell? That's a design and tech lab that you have. What is the role of R&D? And tell us just a little bit about Airbell.
Well, it's exciting. Airbell was the name of the safe house in Marseille that forged the passports for people like Marc Chagall. So the idea is it's a safe house for new ideas. I'm very proud of this. I mean, I didn't go to business school, but I did one thing right, at least as a CEO, and that is that we wanted our R&D team to be of the IRC, but not bound up in our own bureaucracy. So we set them up semi-independent. They've got a semi-independent board. They report to me. It's designed to be a bit of grit in the oyster.
Okay.
And I think that we started off with $1 million, and it's now a $23 million operation a year. It's got 100.
When did that start?
10 years ago.
10 years ago. Okay, so when you started. All right.
Some of the most exciting things there, it's behavioral scientists, it's technologists, it's humanitarians, it's innovative finance people. It's a different human blend that I think is geared up to play this challenge function. Issues like sexual and reproductive health, maternal and newborn health. 60% of women who die in childbirth die in the places that we work. We want to do something about that. Malnutrition, 80% of kids who are acutely malnourished get no help. We want to do something about that. Climate resilience. We think we're doing some very interesting work in northeast Syria, Pakistan, about seed strengthening. These are the communities who, in the normal course of things, will be on the last to receive the innovation.
Right.
We want them up the queue, up the line.
How does that group function? Are they kind of a skunkworks out there, just sort of taking in ideas that cross their plates? Or how do you manage them? How do you choose the projects?
We choose the projects by where there is greatest need and greatest lack of evidence.
Okay.
So we're trying to get into the innovation evidence piece. Skunks smell, so I don't want to call them a skunk works. So I wouldn't say that. They are managed in teams. There's a big change going on, though, which I wanted to flag to you. We've done a lot of work in 10 years generating internally solutions. And in malnutrition, in sexual and reproductive health, we've got some good ideas. But we see our role in the future being the opposite, being the broker of ideas that start outside and are brought in. And we think that's going to be faster test, faster fail, faster succeed. And we want this brokerage function. We've got this extraordinary network of 330 field sites in the most challenging places. We want to be the broker that allows innovation to come in and test itself in those places.
Let's spend just a minute more on the program that you mentioned that I believe was in Nigeria that we wrote about in Fast Company, which is this anticipatory donations action for, you mentioned farmers. If I have this right here, it's the money was from Google.org, Google's foundation, to give, I believe in the IRC's case, about 3,000 households, roughly $400 a piece before the floods hit.
Well, the key thing was two sides of the valley.
Okay.
So basically the same people in northern Nigeria.
Okay.
One side you give the money a week in advance. One side you give the money after the disaster strikes.
Okay.
It's ridiculous that you have to prove this, but we did prove it. Surprise, surprise. It's better to give the money in advance.
So it was a little bit of a study on the ground there.
Well, it was a randomized control study.
Yeah,
so it was a proper piece of work. And it showed that common sense is actually the truth in this case, that if you give people resources before disaster, they protect their resources, they protect their assets.
Right, rather than the less efficient use of money after a disaster, I imagine.
And basically 99.999% of the global humanitarian budget goes in reaction to disaster rather than in prevention.
Let's switch into leadership. I'd love to ask you some questions about that. You transitioned from managing, correct me if my numbers are off here, something around 15,000 people around the world as the foreign secretary to managing a not radically different number as CEO of the IRC. Let me first of all stop and say, are those numbers correct?
The numbers are, but I wasn't the CEO of the Foreign Office.
Well,
so
correct, but you were managing those teams.
Well, I think that the civil service would smile at the idea that politicians were managing anything.
Yes, fair,
so
fair.
I was the Foreign Secretary in the UK system means that you're the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. Right. So I'm equivalent of your Secretary of State. It was, first of all, Condoleezza Rice for my first 18 months, and then Hillary Clinton was my opposite number for the second 18 months of the time that I was in office. And it was not, I had the permanent undersecretary was the lead civil servant of the Foreign Office. He would say, and he would be correct to say, that he was managing the operation.
He was the manager. Yes.
He was the manager. So I moved, and obviously there was a question, well, how would you neglect the internals at the expense of just doing the external? After a couple of years, the board said, well, we're a bit worried you're spending too much time on the internal and not enough time on the external.
Okay.
So it's been a change. I think that obviously it's a whole new frontier if you're the CEO rather than, I don't know, it's not quite right, but if you're the lead politician, you're not, the chairman of the board isn't quite right, but you're a public-facing.
You're sort of the chief communicator
you
among
certainly
other
are.
things.
And if you're a good politician, you're the chief strategist as well, because you're trying to decide what it is that you're trying to do and how you're going to do it. But it is a very different role. We've grown as an organization. I had to do a lot of listening, which I think is actually common to both roles.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of people think that if you're a politician, all you do is talk. The best politicians, I think, listen as well as talk. But it's a different role because the buck stops with you in a different sort of way. If you're the CEO of it's not a company, it's a non-profit organization, than if you're the lead politician.
What did you bring from the political world? And what did you not bring? What did you have to sort of leave behind as you entered the CEO seat?
Well, you leave behind all the people on the other side of the House of Commons who are trying to kill you. So that's sort of something. Generally, people want charitable work to succeed rather than fail. So it's a different. Now, the danger is that you end up in a sort of comfortable blancmange of mushiness there. I think what I brought, some of the things I brought were, one, an understanding that if you're not absolutely clear what you're trying to do, you're going to get blown off course. Mm-hmm. And that's very true in politics. And I think it's true in the NGO sector as well. The danger is that you have mission drift. I think I brought, one of the things that politics teaches, probably the best thing that politics teaches, is to think 3, 4, and 5 moves ahead. It's programmed into your DNA. Okay, I can see immediately how this is going to go wrong. And I think that's a very healthy talent, not just how it will go wrong in media terms, but how it will go wrong. And that, I felt politics taught me that. It ingrained in me a way of thinking about problems and seeing how they play out, not just in media terms, but in concrete terms. I think that was probably a very big thing. I think politics also teaches humility, because there's an old say, all political careers end in failure. And I think that you have a very strong sense, if you're in politics and government, of all the things that can get in your way and stop you getting stuff done. So it's good for the ego. It reduces, it cures any ego problems, or it should. And so I think I brought those. But obviously, there's a huge amount you have to learn. You have to learn about that. I was foreign minister, so it was an adjacent sector to humanitarian aid, but it's different. But I nonetheless had a lot of learning to do. I think that the way in which internal and external communication reinforce each other has been something to work on. I think that timelines, because in politics you've got the next minute's headline, but you've also got the fact it takes time to get stuff done. It's different in the NGO sector, but you've got to be very committed to seeing things through, I think. Right. Otherwise you lose momentum. So I think I've had to really work on that. You've got to manage upwards in a different way, because you've got a board and you've got donors. It's a different situation. So that's been if you want money, ask for advice. I've learned that.
Yes. Well, what about you were the member of a political party before, and now you run an organization where I would imagine that you need to be, I mean, ironically enough, a politician in the sense of not wanting to necessarily be too explicitly partisan. Are there things that you miss being able to say?
Of course. But in politics, you're constrained as well, because you're part of a government. You have to stick to the government line. But we're a non-political organization. From the beginning, to be fair to the opposite party in the UK, the Conservative Party, were in government for the large part of my time at IRC. And they basically said, look, if you don't play games, we won't play games. And since I wasn't playing games, they didn't play games. And different administrations have come through in the US, and that's been fine because it's very important that we stick to our lane. Because if you become just a rent-a-quote, right, then it's a problem. And we do the loudest talking through what we do. It's important that we talk and that we're able to do so, but we do so in our lane.
You said that this is kind of an unprecedented situation in the NGO sector in your world, and which is part of that. Morale. You're a leader of a large organization. I would imagine that morale took a hit, to say the least. How do you manage that?
Yeah. It's interesting, of course, because the CEO is the last person to ask what does the organization really think. But it's been very, very interesting. The truth is the last 4 months have brought the best out of the organization. Partly that's an external hit that we've taken. Yeah. No one can blame their colleagues for what's happened. That's key. It's been an external hit. We've been very transparent about what we know and what we don't know and why we're taking decisions. So when you're laying off 4,000 to 5,000 people, you've got to tend to them. And we've had to reduce in various ways some of the redundancy and other terms, but people have understood why we're doing it. And those who are staying, the majority, they've got to have confidence that there's going to be a job for them the month, the year later. And so we talk a lot about superordinate goal. And the superordinate goal is to serve our clients whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster. And we've built everything we've done back to our responsibility to them. And I think that's helped the organization feel that we're here for a purpose, we know what we're doing, and there's a route through.
David Miliband, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Office Hour is part of the Fast Company podcast network. Our show is produced by Yasmin Gagne and Matt Toder. Mix and sound design by Nicholas Torres, and our executive producer is Josh Christensen. Be sure to subscribe to Office Hour on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also hear all episodes in the Most Innovative Companies podcast feed. If you like this podcast, leave us a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, or let us know in the comments of Fast Company's social media.